We're very glad to be able to spend some time this morning on issues related to public policy and education. This panel discussion, we've asked each of our panelists, who we'll introduce in a moment, to share with you for a few minutes about what they've been thinking about around education, both anything that they want to reflect on over the last year for context, but also where they see us going over the course of the coming year or so. Then we will then hopefully have most of the time for questions and answers and discussion. Jeff Francis from the VSA and I are jointly moderating this panel. I'm going to kick it off and try to hold people to the time limits that we've established, and then Jeff will take the mic and facilitate the broader discussion time. It is very clear from obviously our day-to-day lives, but also from the conversations that we've had over the past day and a half, that we are in a time of unprecedented change. Obviously, our kids are experiencing life very differently than most of us did. We have been struck by the kinds of things that are going on in the state of Vermont, very exciting things about advancing education so that we're engaging every single child. Obviously, the heart of education work takes place every day in your schools, by your teachers, principals, superintendents, and by board members struggling with the day-to-day work of actually making all of this happen. But obviously, education is, at some level, everybody's business. I think there's probably no other endeavor in government where people feel more personally connected to the activity. And so the statewide public policy that surrounds the work that we do is extremely important. So that's why we're doing this panel this morning, so you can hear what a number of our primary public policy officials are thinking about, and so that we can engage in this conversation together between folks that have a statewide view and those of us that have responsibility in each of the areas of Vermont. So let me introduce our panelists, and we'll ask each of them to share a couple things with you. Starting here, Stephen Morse is the chair of the State Board of Education. Susan Bartlett is the governor's key assistant on matters related to education. Next, Kevin Mullen is the chair of the Senate Education Committee. Joey Donovan is the chair of the House Education Committee, and Armando Villaseca is the commissioner of the Department of Education. And these really are folks that have the primary responsibility for making sure that we have a comprehensive statewide policy approach to education. So we are thrilled that they're all here this morning spending this time with us. And they also understand that we are denying you lunch for an extended period of time, so this will need to be a very lively session. So Stephen has agreed to go first. We've asked each of them to limit themselves to 5 or 6 minutes up front here.
Good morning, and thank you for the invitation to be here. I find this very interesting when we can talk together about educational issues. We were asked to talk about the most significant public policy issue that we were aware of. So in my mind, what comes to mind very quickly is Act 98 that passed in the last legislative session, creating the Agency of Education and the appointment of a secretary. I want to go over what I see some of the ramifications of that legislation and give you a brief update of where we are in that process. The agency will be created in the coming year. The secretary will be appointed by the governor from 3 nominations of the State Board of Education. And in my opinion, this probably will be the most significant action in education in ages. This is a very dynamic and dramatic change. It's an idea that's been around, I think it goes back to Phil Hoff's days, back to the 60s. And for some reason, it's never been able to pass a legislative session, and I don't have a glimmer of understanding why it did this year, but it indeed did pass just this year, and we're going to have, well, it could be leadership. I didn't mean that as a humorous line, but it is intriguing, though, that every governor since Phil Hoff has supported this idea or promoted it, and for some year under the leadership of Governor Shumlin and educational leaders in the House and the Senate, it did become law. Under this new law, the commission becomes an agency. The governor, as I said, will appoint the secretary, unlike the process now where the board actually appointed the commissioner. And Section 4 goes on to say that the board gives the board some clarity on the board activity. The board will evaluate educational policy proposals, engage local school board members, which I would think you'd all be very interested in, and establishes and the board shall establish an advanced educational policy. So if you read this legislation literally, you'll see that we have a new dynamics in who leads the administration of the agency, but the board retains its policy-making authority. Now, it'll be very interesting to see how this works out. I don't think it's clear. You know, the legislation says that the management of the agency will be run by the administration and policy will continue to be set by the board. In my opinion, it's going to take some real work and some real understanding of each other for that to become effective. And I think it's very important that that is established right up front to make sure that this legislation has a real chance of being productive and serving the educational community. If it gets off to a rough start, I don't think that bodes well for this major change. There are a couple of other sections in Act 98 that I'm not sure that the legislature was aware of when it passed, but one section talks about how the board shall retain separate staffing and have its own budget. So at the last State Board of Education meeting, we went through this process, decided that we needed 2 staff members, we needed some budget funds for legal services, and we adopted an annual budget somewhere in the neighborhood of $260,000 that we'll be proposing to the administration and to the legislature. Included, there's no salary increase for board members or the board chair in that budget.
Tough times.
The second thing I want to mention that's in the legislation is that it calls for a major rewrite of Title 16. You all know what Title 16 is, how thick it is. So I think that'll be a very interesting process to watch the legislature to go through that. Now, obviously, when that was put in the legislation, it was meant just to accommodate the change of going from a commission to an agency. But obviously, there's a real opportunity for individuals or others to suggest other changes in it. So I think we all need to pay attention to that rewrite of Title 16. So that's what I consider the most significant change that's going to be has happened, going to be happening in the next few years in education. So where are we in that process? Early on this summer, as chair of the board, I appointed a 4-person board committee to initiate a search. We promoted it nationally, advertised in Vermont, and we have candidates have come in. I would have to say that there was not a huge number of candidates, but some very well qualified candidates. We've narrowed it down to finalists, and we will be meeting next week with the search committee along with the educational partners and Susan Bartlett to hopefully come up with 3 nominees that we're going to be sending to the governor. It's my hope that we will take, the search committee will be able to conclude this process, go back to the full board for approval at the November meeting, which is a month ahead of schedule, so that the governor will have ample time to make this appointment by January 1st. So I see this as a very significant change in education. There's a lot of unknowns, and I think that we all need to work together to make sure that this transition flows smoothly. Thank you.
Thanks.
How did you do it?
You did great. Perfect. We're going to go right down the line first, and then we'll open it up for conversation. Go ahead, Susan.
Interesting position to be in. My boss spoke this morning Now the chair of the state board goes, I'm going, let's see, how close are we? I want to address, first of all, I think the reason this bill passed last year really is about leadership. And having been in the Senate previously and watched this bill bounce around all over the place, when we got to the end of the session, the House had done their work, it was in the Senate. Everybody's like, what does it mean? Steve is the state board, the various groups, we were in Kevin's committee, and Kevin did the classic, which I have always, I think is good leadership, particularly when you're coming out of the chair of a committee. He looked at all of us, said, leave, come back tomorrow morning, resolved. Okay, and we did, and Steve particularly gets a lot of credit for this. We sorted it out. I would say, in looking at the biggest change, I'm going to take a 2-year time frame, having been in, and my boss having been in the job not quite 2 years, is the profound difference in how leadership talks about education now. Education and educators and schools are no longer the bad folks that get beaten up, but are clearly by this administration very well respected. The importance of education, starting at pre-K onward, is truly appreciated, and that is making all the world of difference. So I'd say theirs, for me, is the big change. Yes, what Steve has talked about is a gigantic change. I have great confidence that we'll sort it out. As you all know, I think the big changes that we need to see are how we treat kids. We have to get to a system that truly acknowledges and appreciates the different world that kids are going out into today. We have to appreciate that whether schools like it or not, education is asked to take care of all the family problems that kids are confronted with, whether it's abusive parents, absent parents, poverty, substance abuse, not having food on the table. Schools are asked to take care of all of it. I think the real change, and the governor and I talk about education a lot, and it's getting kids, getting away from Carnegie units and getting to competency-based education that lets kids learn as they need to learn and in practical, real ways, so that every single day, every child is truly engaged in their education every single day that they're in school. I think taking our technical centers and really making them stars and having every student have equal access to technical centers, but also having every student, whether they want to go on and be an architect designer or if they want to be an electrician, take advantage of all the fascinating courses and the technology that's available in our technical centers. We've got a lot of challenges, but we also have a real belief and confidence in education in this state and how kids are going to do. You all know how the governor feels about Nickleby and standardized testing. I think what that's led to is a really good plan for education in this state. I told, as I've talked with Washington several times, how they really helped us in the process of Nickleby was to become our common enemy. And it united us all in focusing on what we all believe and what we want and what we know we can do, and to be able to put that in a plan and start moving forward. So it's a really exciting time for all of you to be involved in education. It's a really challenging time, but I think things bode well, and the changes we're making bode very well for the future of kids in this state. You probably all know the governor well enough to know that. We were laughing earlier. He is a very action-oriented person, and he comes down, he says, I'd like this to happen, and then he's back in a half an hour and says, why haven't you changed it yet? So he's going to keep that kind of pressure applied to all of us, and every year that we don't make significant change, kids are losing out. So change can be hard, change can be scary, but it's incumbent on us to change and to help kids get to a system where they become the best young person that they can be, that we address the complex issues that we have, and mostly that we don't make excuses for why we can't do it. What we say is, here's where we're going, and here's what we're going to accomplish.
Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Hopefully I don't lose my voice. I've been fighting a cold, and I lost my voice 2 days ago at forum, which is never a good thing for a politician not to be able to talk. But the first question that we were given to answer is, what do we think is the most significant public policy that has occurred in the last couple of years? And my answer isn't going to be a specific piece of legislation. My answer really, in my mind, the most significant event to have occurred in education in Vermont in the last few years has been a simple statement made by the governor. And what the governor said, and what we in the legislature quickly embraced, was a desire to brand the state of Vermont as the pre-K to 16 education state. A simple statement. It's a lot easier to say it than it is to put it into action, but it sets the groundwork. And with the governor on your side, we in the legislature can accomplish a lot. And I think that both Joey and I have been blessed to have been given some really good committee members in our committees. And they're not afraid to work for change. They're not going to defend the status quo just for the sake of defending it, but rather they're looking to do what's right and what's best for the students. So the governor made this grandiose statement, and some of us said, well, that's good, he's made the statement, but where do we go from there? I think that the next key piece that fell on the line really was naming Susan as the point person on education in the administration, because she has so much respect from the legislature, and I know from most of you in the room that have had the chance to work with her. So we know that the governor is committed to moving forward on improving education in the state of Vermont. So out of that came different bills, like having the Secretary of Education, creating some more carrots for trying to make sure that we're spending our dollars wisely. Some pieces of legislation that resulted in a summer study this summer that I've been a part of that is looking at equity in education. Is every student in the state of Vermont being given the opportunity for success? And are we giving them the ability to acquire the skills, to take the proper courses, so that what their path will be can be successful, whether it's going on to college or it's entering the workforce through a trade or what have you. And we've had a lot of discussion in the legislature in the last couple of years about trying to create pathways for success, trying to enhance the traditional pathways, but also to broaden the ability to use other pathways to, whether it's dual enrollment or special programs, what have you. We want every student in the state of Vermont to have that success. And so over the summer, as we look forward, I think we're really looking at that big picture, pre-K through 16, trying to brand Vermont as the education state. So no matter where you go, people will say, oh yes, Vermont, is number one in education. And so one of the things that a summer study has been looking at on equity is making sure that everybody has that opportunity for success. So you're going to see legislation that will be debated in the upcoming session, starting at the pre-K level and going right through 16, because we know we're not doing a good job creating opportunities for success in college. We do a pretty good job in Vermont in our spending on K to 12, but both ends of the spectrum are kind of left out, and we have to do a better job. So when we talk about pre-K, we're going to be having discussions about how every child in the state of Vermont and their family can have access to resources that will make it possible for them so that they're ready to learn when they hit kindergarten. So those are the type of discussions that we're going to have in the future. We anxiously await the report and the naming of the new secretary. And really it's an exciting time to be on an education committee in the legislature. And I'm thankful for being in that role right now, and thankful to have my colleague sitting next to me chairing the committee in the House.
First of all, I want to thank Senator Mullen for announcing that he has a cold after he invited me to sit next to him. I also was heartened. I didn't hear all of the governor's remarks this morning, but I think he really did set the stage and talked about things that are important to us and things that we know are needed going forward to building this education state, as Senator Mullen said. I also think that Act 98, creating the agency and a secretary, is going to be instrumental in doing that. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was talking to somebody from the agricultural community that said what a difference it was when Ag became an agency and had a secretary. And they couldn't really articulate the exact reasons what had happened, but they knew that it was a movement and that agriculture had a different momentum than it had before. I believe in politics. I think politics is a good thing, and I think it's going to be exciting to have education be part of a political discussion every 2 years in this state, and it's going to be a discussion about outcomes for children and not just how much things cost. And I think the education community is going to become more accountable because of it. One of the things that I celebrate, which actually happened a little bit before Governor Shumlin took office, as I remember it, I think it was one of the last things that Senator Bartlett did as appropriation chair in the Senate, was we eliminated the caps on pre-K. And I think that was the start of saying pre-K is absolutely vital to building an important and dynamic education system. And I'm hoping going forward next year that we're going to continue to have that conversation. I know it's dear to the governor's heart, and I think we're going to really find a way to increase pre-K and get children ready to learn when they enter kindergarten. Along with that, I would like to see, we know that poverty is pervasive in all of our school districts, some more than others. It is an issue that we need to discuss if we're going to let all children find success. I think we have to be serious about coordinating human services and education on the ground. I think we need a presence of human services in all of our schools, whether it's a social worker or whatever it is. I think it's an enormous request to ask education administrators and teachers to do the work of social workers, and I know many of you are doing that on a daily basis. I think we need to really develop personal learning plans from K through 2, that we're really doing the interventions that are required to build success for kids, and that by 2nd or 3rd grade, children are on the path to success. A lot of that is things that are going to have to happen in your world, but I'm hoping that in Montpelier, in the House Committee of Education, working with the Senate Education Committee and the administration, that we can start to do some of the things that are going to make your work easier. Part of the conversation that I would like to have this session is about the weighting of our educational dollars. If we're really going to make a difference for children in poverty in these early years, do we start to give a little more weight to that? Do we start to give more money that's going to be directed towards their education to get them through and get them on the path of learning and success? I don't have the answers, but I would certainly love to start to have those conversations.
Good morning. I think that many of the things that were discussed, the closing the achievement gap, which I think Representative Donovan was talking about, I spoke about yesterday, that we need to do something about poverty and how do we close that achievement gap and how do we provide additional supports for kids and families in order to be successful. Because again, we've had this conversation for years and years and things still aren't being implemented that we know will work. I'm not going to address some of the things that I think I agree with what folks were saying. What I want to talk about is particularly around the Common Core. The Common Core will be our new standards in Vermont starting in 2015. I was one of the 50 people in the country who voted on implementing this, and it was one of those areas that I've been talking about for years, that it doesn't make sense that we are one country, but we have 50 plus the Commonwealths that have their own standards. So that it was really hard for students who are mobile, who go from state to state, to make comparisons if that's what people want to do. But ultimately, it's about making sure that all kids in all 50 states and all of our territories are addressing the same standards. So that when a student graduates from high school, whether it's in Vermont, in Iowa, or in Hawaii, they've all been exposed to and have met the same standards. And I think that's a huge move in the right direction. I know there are folks around the country who may not particularly support that, but this really was a states-led initiative where all commissioners and secretaries of education around the country voted on this because we saw this as another way of moving forward as a group, because we are ultimately one country. The challenges for us in Vermont are now the transition from the NECAP standards to the Common Core. And I know that most schools are already working on that transition. Many are already adapting some of the standards. So that, I think, is moving in the right direction. It will be a challenge, especially over the last 18 months as we start looking at implementing that system. Along with the Common Core, we're now looking at only 2 assessments nationwide. If you don't count, Texas and Alaska and a couple of states who've chosen to go on their own, but there are 43 states that are now going to be either taking the Smarter Balance assessment, which is what we have chosen to participate in, or PARC, which is what the other, 15 or 16 states have chosen. But again, ultimately, it has reduced our assessment models from 50 plus that we've had for years to 2, again, except for several states that have chosen to write their own assessment that is aligned to the Common Core, or aligned to those standards. That's another transition, and the wonderful thing about that is that it has moved us away from just a paper pencil test where we're not really looking at progress that individual students are making. We're not able to see growth that individual students are making because our current assessment doesn't allow for that. It doesn't provide that opportunity to see how individual students in a class are progressing on those standards. That ties very closely with the personal learning plans that Representative Donovan was talking about, that we really need to look at what are the individual needs of our students. This assessment is one of those models that will help us move in that direction. The question will become down the road is, will we be able to expand the assessments that we use to meet both state and federal accountability? There is accountability, whether we like it or not. That is going to continue to be the mantra, both at the federal level and ultimately at the state level, because we're tied to federal legislation. But it can't be, as I said yesterday, it can't be tied to a single measure, one assessment that determines whether a student or school or state is being successful. So I see the Common Core and the SBAC as probably the 2 biggest and most important, and for you all, the most immediate issue that we all need to deal with. And the challenges for the department or the new agency to provide support to the schools, to teachers, to start making that transition so it is by 2015, by September of 2015, we're all ready to go in those standards and assessments.
Thanks, Armando. I have never moderated a panel that was more on time than this one. I didn't ever have to stand up or do this business or anything. So thank you very much for moving right down the line, and also the diversity of issues. There was very little repetition in terms of the issues that got raised. So we've set the stage now for a conversation with these folks, and Jeff's going to lead this section.
Contrary to my normal style, I'm not going to offer any comments right now. Question and answer period. So what I would ask, however, is that when you pose a question, state your question and name the person who you would like to respond, so that we're not swinging back and forth, up and down the line. And then if others want to add a comment, they can. Rama?
Good morning. Rama Schneider from Williamstown, and a short statement of principle, a quick question preface, and then the question. I'll get through this in 30 seconds. Statement of principle. I accept without reservation we are all here because we are interested in the best results for the kids and the young adults who are the students of Vermont. My difference with you folks is over process, not about outcomes. With that said, I get told by professional educators, I read in the literature, that the most effective education that we're going to get delivered is that which is delivered in a flexible way and is delivered closest to the student. The policies coming out of Montpelier have tended to move the policy-making ability away from the student and up to the supervisory union level and also up now into the governor's office, which seems to be diametrically opposed to where we need to be able to make the day-to-day policy decisions. So the question is actually to the people who are most likely to be legislators, but I'll let anybody take it, is what are you specifically going to do to protect the policy-making autonomy for local districts so that our administrators and our educators can do what they're supposed to be doing, which is delivering a flexible education that is delivered closest to the student?
Kevin, you want to take that? Sure, easy question, sure. It's a fine line that we have to walk, and you're right in everything that you said about really getting to the student level. But as policymakers, we're faced also with the dual role of making sure that everybody is given the opportunity for success. So in a perfect world, our job would be to do nothing, because every student in the state of Vermont would be really have to be being given the opportunity to be instilled with the skill set, to have the opportunities and education equally around the state. What we're seeing is that doesn't necessarily occur. Depending on where you live, decisions are different. And it would be a perfect world if every single teacher was a great teacher, if every single administrator was a great administrator. Unfortunately, we all know that even those who are great in their profession do have periods where they may fall for whatever reason, and the quality education isn't there. So our job really is to protect the students, to make sure that regardless of where they live, regardless of where they go to school, they're given the opportunity for success. So we battle with that on a daily basis. And so we can't just leave it wide open. You know, this is the same argument that homeschoolers make. What homeschoolers say to us on a daily basis is, leave us alone. The state of Vermont should not be involved with us at all. And there are some great homeschoolers, but there are also some that are doing it for the wrong reason. So we play a role that isn't always an easy one, because we have to make tough decisions based on trying to ensure that every child has that success. So, Rama, I'm willing to listen to anything that you can give us for advice on trying to get it down to that level with the student. But on the same token, I also realize that my duties are to make sure that every child in the state of Vermont gets a good education.
I don't have a lot to add to that. I think last year we had a report, the Pikers report, that sort of finally said that we have finally gotten it right, that we have equity when it comes to funding. And now I think the study committee that Kevin is on equity for opportunities may tell us a little bit about that. Certainly, I don't feel as though I go to the committee room every day trying to micromanage local school boards. But I do go in knowing that education is a public good, and it's vital to us in the future of our economy. It's vital to us in citizenship. And certainly, we need to make sure that there's equity for outcomes for children, regardless if they live in South Burlington or if they live in Chester or where they live. And I think we've looked very much in our committee to the value of local control, local input, That is why we have really consciously worked hard for voluntary consolidation. We've tried not to mandate too many things, but it's very important for us that every child in Vermont has equal equity to success.
Thank you. Let me get an indication of how many people have questions they want to ask right now. So that's like 7. So if you would be as brief as you can in your question, and then we'll ask these folks to be as succinct as they can and answer the question so that we can get through as much of this as we can in the time we have remaining. Let's start with Haley.
Great, Haley Roberts, Hyde Park. I thought we heard some really interesting things from kids this morning. I like the notion of the opportunity about equity of opportunity, but I still think what we all know really as educators is holding expectations for kids. We also have to hold out the hope that bothering to go through our process is going to get them somewhere. And as a parent with over $200,000 in student loans, that is not available to most of the state of Vermont. I make choices, I can afford it, but most people can't. So if we really want to notch this up, I love pre-K, but you have to have the other end of the spectrum. And I don't know how we put money on the table around this, but I've served with board members who said, my kids aren't going to school if they don't get a scholarship.
So your question is?
My question is, what can we do about putting really no interest, low interest money on the table to really make after high school available to every kid in Vermont?
Okay, I'm going to define my own rule and ask who wants to take that question, rather than ask Haley to direct it to somebody.
I'll start first. Then.
Sure.
It's nobody else's.
Okay.
That really gets back, Haley, to what I was talking about in my opening remarks, is that we do a really good job in the state of Vermont, K-12. It's both ends that we're failing our students. And you take a look at, I actually thought the numbers that were reported in the press just last week were better than what I was hearing out there. But what we continually hear from students that come before us in the legislature is that they're being faced with making an economic decision. And it's really starting to turn into the fact that no matter how they run the numbers, it doesn't make sense for them to continue their education. And that's exactly the wrong place where we need to be. If we want to be successful in the state of Vermont, it really goes back to the economy. And what is a better driver of our economy than a quality workforce? We can't do everything for everybody in the state of Vermont if we don't have a solid tax base and a solid tax revenue coming in. So if we're committed to creating better paying jobs, better opportunities in the state of Vermont, then we have to be committed to putting more resources into higher education. And no matter how you look at it, whether we're ranked number 2 worst or the worst in the country, it doesn't matter. We're doing a bad job. We have to do better. I don't have a magic solution on where we're going to come up with those funds, but we as a state have to place a higher commitment on our post-secondary education. And what we've allowed ourselves to fall into is, well, we have limited resources, so we're doing the best job that we possibly can do in the K-12 environment, and that's the best that we can do, and we have to limit ourselves to that. I think we have to challenge ourselves and say that's not the best that we can do, and that we have to provide the opportunities, and we have to utilize our resources better, whether it's making sure that maybe we have to take another look at not sending as much money out of state to some of the schools. I know that's a tough decision. But we have to make sure that regardless of the situation the student is in, they can have the opportunity to get a college degree. And I think that that's going to be one of the most talked about issues coming up over the next couple of years, is how do we find the resources and how do we make it possible for success?
Just to, first of all students don't need to go to college. There are a lot of technical programs. If I were an electrician, I would have earned a lot more money than I ever earned in anything that I'm doing now. So A, get away from the notion that it's got to be 4 years. 2, no student should have to take remedial math and reading and writing when they get to college. We can do a lot to help them by getting them out of high school already way past the basics. Next, to take advantage of things like dual enrollment, so that while students are still in high school, they can get credit for high school and college courses as well. Right there is, we could do a lot. We were looking at a combination of programs last year that would have saved at least, in some cases, a full year's cost of college for students if they took advantage of it. So we've got to be willing to do those sorts of things. I'm as many years as chair of appropriations. We're not suddenly going to have millions and millions of dollars to put into higher education. So we've got to figure out, as you can get a little more in, how do you do it? But how do we get kids better prepared and taking the most advantage of advanced courses while they're still in high school?
Let's go to another question. Yes, Judy.
Hi, I'm Judy Polinen. I'm superintendent for the River Valley Tech Center in Springfield. Happy to hear that you like career and technical education. But my question is about distance learning. We house the Vermont Virtual Learning Cooperative, and it's primarily been funded through grants through the state. But my question is, with Title 16, will there be consideration given to recognizing distance learning for all students?
So the question is, within the context of Title 16,
The rewrite.
will there be consideration given for access to distance learning for all students
As well as perhaps funding.
and funding? We wouldn't want to get that.
It's interesting. I certainly think that distance learning is going to be part of, and a very important part of education going forward. Senator Lowe and I were just talking about meeting with our alleged counsel, who has done an absolutely incredible job in the rewrite of 16, and it's going to be part and parcel of our discussions in this next session. So certainly we will have those conversations, and we will certainly listen to people like you who can inform us of the needs and what we do need to do go forward. So I can't give you any great answer today, except to know that I recognize how important it is.
So let's in order to, Steve left the room, but Senator Brock is here, and we're going to be very respectful of his schedule. And I know Steve asked you if you had a couple of minutes. You do, okay. He was going to give me a signal, but he didn't. So let's have another question, and again, be as succinct as you can with the question, and as succinct as you can in responding. Yes.
Peter Merrill, I'm from the Hartford School District. This is more of a concept than perhaps a question. I'll try to be succinct. It's been said that if you have a problem, you've got a problem. If you've got a bunch of problems, you potentially have a chance to do something about it and have an opportunity. Our school district and school systems, as been commented a couple of times, was designed perhaps back in the 1890s or so, when we had exclusively an agrarian society. The time we go to school, the time we get out of school, the months in which we go to school, the months in which we don't go to school, all were based on that fact. Society's changed extraordinarily in that period of time. A lot of the problems you are talking about are related to that. We have more and more poverty, inequity, and so forth, due to the fact that more and more families are single families, or we have families where both members of the household the adults have to work, which means that we ought to be thinking about having a school day, a school year that fits into that schedule, the schedule of the adults. We don't need the children coming home to help with the chores. What we need is, in fact, a place for the children to be while the parents are off earning an income. So that makes me think that if you have a need for pre-K, you also have a place for, you need to have young kids during the day, that the day needs to be longer so the parents can actually earn a living and can have a house where there's less stress over the economics of what's going on. That there are lots and lots of issues where you have schools that have declining enrollments, therefore you have infrastructure which is being underutilized and is very expensive. So I'm wondering what you think about the idea of changing in some fundamental ways when and how our children go to school to fit the changing dynamics of this economy.
So the question is really specific to the school calendar, is that right?
Well, the day, also when does the school start for individuals, pre-K?
Okay.
We know after decades and decades
Yeah,
of research.
we've got it. So it's the structure of the day and the calendar.
We've
And-
elected Steve.
And they've elected,
The policy person.
exactly.
Well, this clearly would continue to be a policy issue under even the new law. And I don't know that we've had extensive conversations at the state board level, but it's certainly something we're aware of. And I would guess, I can't speak for the board on this, but I would guess the board would be open to such suggestions. And that there really is a need to modernize the school calendar. We were in Brattleboro for a meeting last month and heard about one individual school where the teachers had come together and were willing to offer classes either before the normal school day or after the school day. And it sounded like they had worked it out very easily and certainly to the benefit of the students. So I think we're probably open to that and would certainly consider it if it was brought to us.
So here's the ground rule going forward. The question needs to be stated in one sentence. And I appreciate the context, but these folks have an immense amount of context. And two, Senator Brock has graciously agreed to allow us to run this panel for another 5 or 7 minutes. And my condition is that because he's agreed to do that, when they finish, your schedule is to stay and listen to him, because it's only fair. And that's what we're going to do. So does anybody object to that? I'm glad no one does. So one sentence questions. Who has one? Go ahead.
Barry Judge, UD3. The state board will now engage local boards. Could you tell us what engage means?
Well, I would hope that you would notice that since I became chairman that we've reached out, that we've made ourselves much more open and available to board members. I spent a fair amount of time traveling around, talking with boards, listening to boards, and that would continue. We certainly, there's ample time at our monthly board meetings if an individual board wants to bring an issue to us. We certainly hear often and from Steve and from Jeff. So I think we're open, and I was pleased to see in the legislation that wording remained in the law, and I see that as a real strength of the new legislation, that there's an avenue for local boards to work with a policy-making body. I won't speak for the governor, but I can't imagine the governor wanting local boards knocking on his door every day with an issue. So I think this is very good, and the board is open and ready to respond to what local boards respond to. And there's been several examples of that, and I'm not going to take the time to show that now. But
So we'll do 2 more questions, one sentence each. So who, yes.
Isma Smith. Investment in infrastructure is also crucial for advancing the next generation, and we have talked a lot tonight about what we need to do to move the kids to the future. Is there any way to revisit the state aid for construction on renovations?
So the question is, there's been now several-year moratorium on state aid for school construction projects, and the question is, do these folks see any relief to that coming forward?
I, from Burlington, have great sympathy with the moratorium. We have some very significant infrastructure issues, and I just was at a meeting last week with the chair of the Institutions Committee and brought this subject up and said, when are we going to be able to lift the moratorium, start to reach out to the, I think, 17 or more districts are already on the list, and then start to have a conversation about going forward. So it certainly is a conversation that we plan to have. I think, as you all recognize, it's very much dependent on the economy, and I don't know how the administration feels about it, but I know that many of us who serve districts that have these issues need to have that talk.
Susan, did you want to comment on that? Okay, go ahead, John.
John Castle, Superintendent of Schools for Rutland Northeast. In moving to an agency of education, what will be done to expand the capacity of the organization?
Well, that will be, let me first acknowledge that because of the economic times and the economy in recent years, the Department of Education has lost a number of positions, important positions. And I really commend Armando and his staff for picking up and continuing as much work as they've been able to with less staff. You know, the board is going to be out of that. The new agency is going to be submitting the budget to the governor. I think the commission is now reviewing their budget requests, and some of those positions that have been lost, I believe, are going to be asked for, but it'll depend on the state budget. But the board no longer will play a role in staffing the agency. That will be managed and run by the secretary, who is going to serve in the cabinet and be part of the governor's administration. The only, I got to repeat this again, the law does point out that the board will need some staffing, and then we've already voted on a request, and we'll be submitting it to the administration.
Susan, do you have any response to that, or is it too soon to tell?
We haven't met with Jim Reardon yet, so
Yeah.
we'll meet with Jim next week.
Okay, let me close this way. First of all, heartfelt thanks to our panelists. We live in an extraordinary time for public education in Vermont. It is a dynamic time. It is a time that has no shortage of challenges, but it is also a time of great, great opportunity. And I think that opportunity was reflected on consistently through this conference. We are advantaged in Vermont because of the proximity that we have to our state officials. And, you know, any one of these folks would be the first to tell you that they don't always agree with the perspective of the superintendents or the school boards or anybody else who weighs in the discourse around public education in the state. But I will tell you that they were always accessible, they are always thoughtful, and they always give 100% to the challenges we face and the solutions that we craft. Governor Shumlin spoke about working together. These folks have talked about working together. And I think that we are blessed in the state to have people who are at a level with an interest to actually work with us. So thank you very much.